Have our bodies and our immune systems altered after COVID and after the COVID vaccines? And do we even know the answer yet to that question fully? This is a question that has returned as China's COVID surge grabs global anxiety and global headlines. Many of us seem to know somebody who in recent months has had a heart attack. In fact, there's a lot of casual talk about an anecdotal sort of evidence of increased heart attacks. What does the data tell us? Are there really more heart attacks? Are more young people dying from heart attacks? Is there a link to COVID, to long COVID, to the vaccine? Should we be taking boosters? Do boosters in a country like India, where there is hybrid immunity, where most of us have been infected, have any efficacy? And how do you separate the line between irrational anti vaccine rhetoric and legitimate questions that are being raised from within the medical community? These are some of the questions that we attempt to address in this program today. There's a lot, as I said, casual talk about what is being called in the media a spate of heart attacks. We actually looked at the data and we found, let me say this early on, that while there is an increase in younger people between 30 and 60 in India dying from heart attacks, overall the number of heart attacks in India actually remain more or less the same. In fact, there's been a marginal dip in the year from 2020 to 2021. So let me get that straight out of the way and not be alarmist. But there's still a lot else to discuss. As I said, the fundamental question remains, how much have we changed after COVID? And indeed, the debate around vaccines, boosters, which vaccine, should we be taking the vaccine at this stage? Remember, there are more than 700 million Indians who are yet to have taken their third dose, or what in India is called the precaution dose. In other parts of the world, it's called the booster dose. Let me introduce our guests on the program today. Joining us from England today is Dr. Aseem Malhotra. He's an NHS-trained cardiologist, a British Indian, whose own personal loss of his father converted him from being a vaccine supporter to a vaccine skeptic. We'll find out why in a moment from now. Also joining us is one of the foremost scientific minds of India, Dr. Anurag Agrawal. Did some sterling work like everybody else on this panel during COVID in India, is now with the Ashoka University. Good to see you, Doc. Also joining us, Dr. Vineeta Bal, one of India's best-known immunologists and scientific researchers. Good to see you, ma'am. Joining us is community health activist Sachin Taparia, who's been doing some very interesting community level local surveys among people, and we'll ask him his findings in a moment from now. And finally, joining us from the Max Group of Hospitals is Dr. Balbir Singh, who heads cardiology there. So great to see all of you. And let me actually start with you, Dr. Balbir Singh, if I can, before I come to Aseem, because I have some sense of what Aseem is going to say, but I don't know what you're going to say. If you look at the data, and we have the number of heart attacks, anecdotally, everybody in India's drawing rooms is saying, oh, there are many more heart attacks taking place. But when we looked at the data, we found that actually, can we bring up those numbers, please? There's actually a marginal dip from 2020 to 2021, at least in the recorded cases. But there are age groups that are showing a kind of differentiation. And that age group is actually between 30 to 60. 70% of heart attack deaths in India have occurred in this age group, and there's been a slender increase of cases. In fact, about 6%, as you will see in the last slide, in this particular age group. Is this lifestyle? Is this COVID? Is this, as Dr. Malhotra might argue, something to do with the vaccine? Do we not know enough? Lots of questions there. Dr. Balbir Singh, let me ask you your thoughts. Are we looking at an increased rate of heart attacks, no matter what those numbers tell us? Are you finding something different in hospital these days?
So I would not. I would agree with you that the number of heart attacks is not increased. One change I have seen in this COVID and the post-COVID era, that people have realized the importance of health and the healthcare systems, because they were sitting at homes just thinking about health and healthcare systems through media and other activities. So they understood what hospitals mean. So a good change that has happened, which I'm seeing, is the patients are now coming with symptoms early enough to get their treatment done. They have developed more confidence on doctors and physicians and the hospitals, which can now give good treatment to them. And I would be not agreeing with people who are trying to dissuade people from vaccines and saying that vaccine has increased the incidence of heart attack. It has not done. And about the debate about 30 to 60 dying more often is always there. We know that it happens. The youngers die more often because the collateral system is not developed in them. So when they develop a heart attack, there is a zero collateral in them. A sudden heart attack comes and it can take life. There's a very interesting paper which just published in JAMA last month. JAMA is an American journal which is very well renowned, and that very interesting article that actually this debate about COVID vaccine increasing heart attacks was put to rest. So they said that actually COVID vaccine has reduced the number of episodes who took vaccine, the number of heart attacks were less. Now you would say, how does COVID vaccine prevent? Through preventing COVID. So preventing a COVID severe illness, which is a thrombotic event, so COVID gives thrombosis, actually increases heart attack incidence, which we know, which happened during the COVID era. We saw a lot of heart attacks that time. So vaccine actually prevents COVID and may prevent a heart attack. So this data was very clear that the vaccine is not increasing. If at all, there may be a marginal benefit in the number of heart attacks in these patients. So this is my opinion, and it is backed by literature. It is backed by the numbers and personal experience.
Okay, so that's a very clear, lucidly argued position. Let me now go across to someone who has a completely different sort of opinion. Dr. Aseem Malhotra is joining us from Europe today. As I said, he's an NHS-trained cardiologist. Dr. Malhotra, you started off by being an advocate of the vaccine. You were actually trying to address what was then known as vaccine hesitancy. You went on social media platforms and you actually batted for the vaccine, as it were. This is one of your old tweets from 2020, which said vaccines are the safest of all drugs. Then you had a personal tragedy in your family. You lost your father, very much like my father, who I also lost to COVID. I read about an ambulance delay. Something similar happened with me. The oxygen cylinder in the ambulance that carried my dad to hospital didn't actually work. I thought my father died because he didn't get two vaccines. You think your father died possibly because he had an mRNA vaccine. Like, we have two completely different responses. Why did you think that, Dr. Malhotra? How and why did you go from being a vaccine advocate like all other people at the front line to somebody who believed that you lost your father due to the mRNA product? He died, of course, from a cardiac arrest. Dr. Malhotra.
Thank you, Barkha. Yes, so just to walk you through that, first and foremost, I must reinforce what you've already said, and I still believe this to be the case, that traditional vaccines are, when you look at all of the drugs that we prescribe, as a pharmacological intervention, one of the safest. And certainly, data suggests globally, and this is particularly important in countries like India and other developing countries, vaccines do save lives, traditional vaccines. But those vaccines go normally through very rigorous safety testing over a number of years. I myself, I was born in Delhi. Both my parents are graduates of Indian medical colleges. I still have many scars on my left arm from BCG, even smallpox. I have the smallpox vaccine. So I'm very much a supporter of traditional vaccines. That has not changed. But what happened with me is, and with that, keeping that in mind, when we originally started rolling out the vaccines in the UK, I could not in any way, shape or form think that a vaccine, which are the holy grail in medicine, could cause any significant harm, and certainly not harm to the heart. And in fact, I have many friends, I've worked in health policy roles, people who are well known in India, for example, the film director Grinda Chadha, Shekhar Kapoor, I just spoke to shortly before this interview. I'm going to tell you what I told him and what he's doing in a minute. And these people took the vaccine under my encouragement. Okay, so let's make that very clear. So that was January, and in February 2021, Good Morning Britain, which is one of the most watched TV programs in the UK, asked me to go on the show to help tackle vaccine hesitancy amongst ethnic minority communities. Certainly abroad, ethnic minority communities, people from the Black community, Indian groups, for example, tend to be more vaccine hesitant because of less trust in government. So I went on to reassure people. And then things evolved over time. So the first thing, of course, is my dad, who was a very well-known doctor in the UK, general practitioner. He was a vice president of the British Medical Association, first non-white person to reach that role. So, very well-known doctor. He also very much was supportive of the vaccine rollout. He had 2 doses of Pfizer. And he suffered a sudden cardiac death, which was unexplained at the time. I knew his cardiac history inside out. He was one of the healthiest people of his age at 73. And his post-mortem findings did not make sense to me. He had 2 critical stenosis in his arteries, essentially 2 severe blockages. that had rapidly progressed because we had done some scans on him a few years earlier. So that didn't make any sense to me. And of course, my area of research is actually changing the understanding of how heart disease develops and how we can potentially reverse it. I've published in medical journals extensively on this. My colleague earlier talked about publishing in JAMA. We published, with the editor of JAMA Internal Medicine is a cardiologist, and another cardiologist. We published an editorial a few years ago explaining that heart disease is an inflammatory condition. So things then evolved, and then several bits of data started to come to me, which were very disturbing. The first one was an abstract published in Circulation, which essentially suggested, Barkha, that the mRNA vaccines, and we're talking about mRNA vaccines specifically now, but I'm going to come on to Covishield in a minute, is it increases inflammatory markers in the blood that are linked to cardiovascular risk, okay? Essentially accelerating heart disease and accelerating heart attacks. But it was just one bit of data. Since then, many bits of data have emerged that show clear causal evidence that the mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, are linked to serious adverse events, the most common of which are clotting abnormalities, heart attacks, strokes, pulmonary embolism. That is irrefutable. So there is no doubt whatsoever that the COVID vaccines are increasing the risk of heart attacks. Now, whether COVID does that is very debatable. Certainly we know with severe COVID at the beginning, of course, any inflammatory condition on the body, any stress on the body, pneumonias, for example, are going to exacerbate cardiovascular problems. But we now have very good data showing mild COVID does not do that. In fact, interestingly, a publication only a few weeks ago in BMJ Heart revealed that mild COVID was associated with less risk of a heart attack.
So can I jump in? Can I jump in with two
Sure.
points, and then before you tell us about your argument on all the vaccines together, I want to give the panel a chance to respond to what you said. But some points for you. The British Heart Foundation, in response to your argument, said that there is no evidence to link increased cardiac risk to the vaccines. I'm just quoting here verbatim. Secondly, we have now reasonable data from all across the world, including in India, to show, I'm not a doctor, I can't tell you what other impacts the vaccines have, but that the vaccines appear to have worked for the one purpose that they were meant for, which is to contain hospitalizations and mortality. And if we bring up these slides, you will see an Indian Council for Medical Research study in 2021 found that hospitalizations were down to 9.8% and 0.4% mortality after 2 doses. So I take you back to my dad, Aseem. I kept thinking, gosh, if he'd got the second dose in time, maybe he would have lived. This is another paper from Yale University and the University of Maryland that has argued that vaccines prevented 18.5 million additional hospitalizations and 3.2 additional million deaths. And without the vaccines, there would have been 120 million additional COVID infections. Now, quickly, because I want to give the others a chance to respond, and we'll come back to you. Do you acknowledge that the vaccines have helped in containing hospitalizations and mortalities? Yes, they obviously did not take the time to be tested in the way that a normal vaccine would, but it was a global crisis. That time wasn't available.
So the answer to your question, Barkha, is first and foremost, when we look at this data, they're called non-randomized studies, right? And I will quote the Stephen Hawking of medicine, Professor John Ioannidis, the most cited medical researcher in the world, independent, has great scientific integrity. And he said these findings from non-randomized studies may be spurious, in other words, fake. Now, that doesn't mean that they haven't helped and reduced COVID mortality and hospitalization. I'm not saying that. In fact, my own peer-reviewed research independently, published in a journal, by the way, that doesn't take money from pharma. Just to go back to Dr. Balbir Singh, I'm not contradicting what he said, but people need to understand many of these medical journals, most of the ones you've cited, are heavily conflicted. They get hundreds of thousands, if not millions, from the drug companies. And that's really important because we need clear independent data here. Now, just very quickly, Barkha, to answer the question, to break it down in terms of your father, I'm very sorry you lost your father. And by the way, the editor of the journal that I published in, we had a conversation first, also lost her own one of her own parents to COVID. So we're not denying that COVID at the beginning was very, very devastating. I know friends and family and people in India, for example, that died. We're not denying that. The question is, what benefit does a vaccine add? Now, we analyzed this in the UK, and I looked at Delta variant, and we broke it down by age. And this is really important because without understanding the numbers involved, the public and doctors are vulnerable to exploitation of their hopes and anxieties by vested interests. And I mean big pharma here. Okay. Now, let me just break it down. It's very important, Barkha. So if you're over 80 on the Delta variant, at best, the COVID vaccine reduces your risk of hospitalization or death from COVID by 1 in 230. 520 if you're 70 to 80. We're then talking about thousands. Now, what's the risk of serious adverse events? That's important. Because if there are no adverse events, Barkha, put it in the water supply. Put it in the water supply. You'll save many, many lives. The adverse events we are seeing are unprecedented. And with AstraZeneca in this country, which is Covishield in India, we actually stopped using it because the amount of adverse effects were unprecedented. We stopped using it, effectively suspended it. And you've carried on using it in India, which is horrific. And by the way, Prime Minister Modi, I must just say this, he must call for a complete suspension of all COVID vaccines pending an independent panel of scientists. And please liaise with people in the UK like Carl Hennigan, the director of evidence-based medicine.
Okay, I need to jump in now.
Who you know in the US, because this is horrific. This is horrific, and it needs to stop.
Let me come in. You know that the data I have quoted, you have summarily sort of dismissed as, possibly compromised. But Dr. Anurag Agrawal, the fact is, as someone who spent 2 years traveling across India through those hospitals, we don't see what we were seeing. And that can't lie. The fact that there are beds available, that there is oxygen available, that people aren't going to hospital very rarely for COVID, that doesn't lie. We're all on the ground following this. Dr. Malhotra told me that, AstraZeneca is no longer being administered in the United Kingdom. I looked quite hard, Aseem, to find an official announcement. I found none. My own understanding was that they were trying to do a heterogeneous combination. So because most of England had been administered the AstraZeneca, now they were looking at the mRNAs, but the doctors will know more. Anurag, first to you, then Vineeta, and Sachin, I'll come to you at the end of that. Dr. Anurag Agrawal, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Barkha. I see that two different threads of discussion we are having here. One thread pertains to did vaccines work in reducing severe disease? And I would say that irrespective of the fact that most data does not come from large RCTs, there is outstanding work from excellently studied cohorts in Qatar, for example. Look at any of the papers by Abu Laith, bunch of them in New England Journal. And again, we can't really say that those journals suddenly become bad in the same places where we published before, because they also publish pharma things. And the data is comprehensive and conclusive. Vaccines are extremely good at preventing severe disease. Now we come to the second part. Can vaccines also have side effects, and particularly the COVID vaccines? And Barkha, I will specifically take up one place where I do agree with Dr. Aseem to a small degree. With the AstraZeneca vaccine, there was a report of cerebral venous thrombosis, some fatal disease, thrombotic things, in maybe 1 in 1 lakh patients, particularly towards young females. And there was some logic towards preferring a non-AstraZeneca vaccines for young females. But if you look at risk versus benefit, every COVID vaccine had greater benefit than risk during the COVID pandemic.
And one in 1 lakh statistically would not be considered a significant number, would you say, or it would?
Well, every death matters to the person who has it and their families.
Sure.
In that sense, given that Delhi is probably 20 crores, you're going to talk about a large number of deaths within Delhi if everybody was vaccinated. But India did well in not using vaccination for young children, etc., who were anyway at not high risk of death. So I think the risk-benefit profile and choices made by India were very appropriate. And of course, we don't know so much data in terms of risk outcome monitoring for Covaxin as we do for other vaccines. But I would imagine that by and large, our decisions from the point of view of maximizing benefit and minimizing risk, excluding young children from the vaccination program, were all appropriate.
Vineeta, sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Agrawal. Complete your point. Yeah.
So the second part is, can vaccine have side effects? They do. I mean, take oral polio vaccines, take the live virus. There are plenty of instances of some cases of polio, for example, being created by vaccines, and they were an integral part of our program. But the reality is it's always risk versus benefit. Everything has risk. Every medicine you take has risk. And the risk-benefit profile is favorable for vaccines, and we can't let individual experiences of singular cases distort our view, and which tends to happen. Clearly, and there are two pieces of data I will cite why this is particularly important. what happened is that vaccines stopped protecting against infection and only against severe disease. Infections became rampant.
Yeah.
There is one very nice study from the VA hospital system earlier this year, one from the Queen Mary from the UK Biobank, one showing that even mild COVID 19 can increase the risk of cardiovascular events subsequently, one showing primarily confined to hospitalized patients.
Hmm.
So I think I would disagree with Dr. Aseem that mild COVID does not have cardiac sequelae. It does. And in fact, I would argue that anything that prevents infection probably will end up having more impact on reducing sequelae. Unfortunately, today, vaccines are not very good at preventing Omicron infections. So that benefit has gone down. But overall, I think the balance of the data is strongly in favor of vaccines, not against vaccines. I'll stop here for the time.
Okay, Aseem, I'll give you a chance after everyone has spoken to rebut different points. Let me bring in those who haven't spoken yet. Dr. Vineeta Bal, you have had some skepticism over whether boosters, for example, a third shot, would make any sense right now for India, where again, may I remind our audience that more than 700 million Indians have not bothered to take the booster. This is not because of a lack of supply. There was just a kind of, okay, life is opening up, we're okay, let's carry on. Boosters are a different debate. There's a Dr. Malhotra who's calling for, let's just suspend these vaccines at this point. Now, I don't think, with respect to Dr. Malhotra, either the UK or India is going to do that. But do you believe there are questions now that we are almost 3 years after the pandemic that we need to be looking at in a more dispassionate way without the polarization of vaxxers versus anti-vaxxers?
Uh, yes and no. So I will begin with the point that I have read some of the papers that Dr. Aseem has published, and there seems to be some rationale, especially for the mRNA vaccines, that he had looked at the trial. There were issues with the clinical trials done, phase 3 trials done by Pfizer, and so on and so forth. So I am not willing to completely condemn what he is saying. Of course, there seems to be some data, and collecting poor data from clinical trials from US, from UK is a little more startling than us in India not getting proper data, because that we are notorious for. Not getting good data is sort of, the basis of our lives. So in that sense, we don't have enough adverse events reported. So while we only can talk about Covishield and Covaxin, and yes, of course, for Covishield, the thrombotic events have been reported very sparsely in India, but in general, reporting is very, 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 very poor. So in that sense, we do not have a real picture. However, I agree with Anurag when he says that the advantages of a vaccine are still more than not getting a vaccine. And that is linked, in my mind, to the public healthcare system. Max and other specialty hospitals, of course, are available only for a minority of the population, not just because they are few in numbers, but affordability is also a question. So
Sure.
public health related hospitals or public hospitals are really few and far between. Their infrastructure was even worse. So ordinary people who can't afford to go to private hospitals, if they get infected and they need oxygen and they need many more of the drugs and whatever treatment, for that we had such poor system available that I certainly think that vaccination, which decreases the severity, morbidity, and mortality of the COVID disease, is something that is definitely worthwhile. But there are many ifs and buts that I have been putting. So saying that vaccines are bad or vaccines are good is not the way to go ahead. And I have also haven't come across Covishield being seriously banned. I mean, in UK, but in India, again, those were the only two vaccines which were
And
available.
90% of India,
Is
it was 88,
Covishield.
90% of
Yes,
India is vaccinated by Covishield. And
yes.
uh, and
10%, 10% by Covaxin, and
yeah,
Covaxin is one of the traditional vaccines, so that Dr. Aseem would have less problem with that. But unfortunately, that wasn't available to a significant numbers. And as it turns out, in Indian population, some preliminary data seem to show that Covaxin responses were somewhat poorer immune responses. I'm not talking about efficacy and efficiency in protection and so on, but immune responses were somewhat poorer than the Covishield responses. So assuming immune response has a reasonable correlation with protection, one can think that Covishield was more protective, but that's going beside the point. And I think severe disease was a major problem in India, and we simply cannot ignore that, because that is something that was prevented. And I understand there is a difference between Delta and Omicron. But between Delta and Omicron, all of us were more or less either infected or vaccinated. So impact of Omicron was practically, very, very minimal as compared to Delta.
Absolutely.
We were not particularly better prepared, I think. We were somewhat better prepared. But still, I think Omicron did not affect us as badly. And I am not so keen on promoting that what the government did was the best policy, but that's a separate matter.
Okay, we'll come to what you think on boosters, and I know Aseem is on record saying that for Omicron the mRNA vaccine is almost redundant. So boosters, Omicron is a whole different argument, I think, from Alpha and Delta. But let me just bring in Sachin. Sachin, you're at the community level serving people. My question is this: there's so many things today that could make people feel more ill than they used to. One, as Dr. Balbir Singh said, is greater awareness. There's now this impending fear all the time. Could there be another pandemic coming? Could there be another surge coming? Two, we forget that we in India contentiously medicated almost everybody with steroids. That has significantly lowered immunity in so many of our people. I went through this, and I know so many other people who did. The jury is still out on long COVID. We now know COVID to be not just respiratory, but also impacting the neurological system. So, Sachin, what are your findings? And, I'd be very careful about what we link it to as you tell us your findings. Sachin.
Thank you, Barkha, for having me. So, Barkha, we take up subjects for surveys based on what people are talking about and what is it that they are, regularly discussing and raising concerns about. And one of the issues that has been there in the minds of the public over the last 2 years, increasingly of late in the last 6 to 9 months, is, the onset of severe medical conditions in somebody in their close network. It could be a family member, it could be a friend, a colleague, or a neighbor, but somebody close to them. So, the survey that we did was a network prevalence survey where we try to understand from people, what has happened in their close network. Has there been an onset of severe medical conditions in one or more, in their network? And when we define severe medical conditions, we just didn't limit it to heart attack, because we were hearing other things from the public in the community feedback exercises that we do. And these ranged from, heart attack to brain stroke, to cancer acceleration, neurological conditions, brain fog, and memory issues, and a whole host of things, basically. So the recent survey that we did, that we released in early December, basically indicated that 51% people, and we've gone across 357 districts of the country, gotten responses, about 32,000 responses in this exercise, the most latest one. 51% people have one or more individuals now in their close network who has had onset of a severe medical condition. And we are not talking about, COVID as a condition and the COVID deaths that happened. We're talking about a medical condition, basically, beyond COVID. This number was at 31% in December of 2021. So there we had looked at 1 year of data, and now we have looked at 2 years of data, basically. And the number is 51%. Then what we did was we asked these people, do you know the vaccination status of this individual in your close network? And 62% of these individuals were double dose vaccinated. About 11% were single dose vaccinated, and 8% were unvaccinated. The rest of the respondents, did not know about the vaccination status of the individual.
Okay.
Then we also asked, just to complete the overview, We also asked, about their COVID status. And 61%, people said that these individuals had COVID once or more. In 28% of the cases, the individual did not have at least symptomatic COVID. So, overall, our submission to the government has been that, look, we really need to research this. Is COVID causing, something like this? Is it, a particular type of vaccine or a batch of vaccine that is causing, something like this? Is it a combination of the two? Is it happening in certain blood groups and certain body types? Is COVID reinfection, at play here? I think the reality is that we really need to do some thorough research. And you started your...
Sorry, I have no quarrel at all with thorough scientific research, but I think we learned this during COVID, that early conclusions are dangerous conclusions. You couldn't convince Indians, for example, to stop taking ivermectin. Even the pharmaceutical, there's been talk of big pharma. Even the pharmaceutical company had to issue a statement saying, please don't take it, and we still kept taking it. So we also, Dr. Balbir, at a point where there's greater vulnerability about health. Certainly, when I Google any symptom, I think I have every ailment under the sun, and I'm sure there are many people, and I'm reasonably aware. But there's a serious point to what Sachin is raising. We don't know fully what this pandemic did or did not do, and of course, I think, as was pointed out by Dr. Anurag, every medicine, every drug can and will have some side effect, but you do a cost-benefit analysis. Again, I ask you, Dr. Singh, has anything changed? Do you find people more worried? Yes, but other than that, has anything changed that gives you pause?
So, first, I've heard everybody. I would just add a few things to this.
Sure.
Vaccination was happening very actively all over the world. People were very scared. Almost everybody was getting vaccinated. So this is a random event which was happening. Now, if somebody had an MI or a heart attack after that, he may have had with or without vaccine. So the vaccine got the bad name. In Dr. Aseem's case, his father already had 2 stents. Autopsy shows serious blockages. We know these patients are vulnerable to sudden death. To blame the vaccine to that, when events are so random in cardiac patients, they happen so randomly, can sometimes be exaggerating things too much. And that is for the vaccine. Now, how has COVID changed our lives? COVID has changed our lives by making us aware that how difficult a medical field is, how challenging medical services can be, and how we can be challenged by these medicines. So this has come as a startling thing to us. We always thought we have enough hospitals, we have enough beds to treat our population. We don't have. The second important thing happened is to the people and the public at large. Now, sometimes we get patients who come with anxiety neurosis that they had chest pain, but they rush to us. It's good that they come because at least we can allay if there is something wrong, we can treat them well. So it is true that public services and private services will have differences. It happens all over the world. It's not India only. It happens all over the world. But both the private and the public services have to gear up for a catastrophe like that which happened. And I can tell you that even if we leave the catastrophe, if we talk of the general heart attacks and the general heart patients and general other disease patients, the beds are not enough in our country to treat them. We need to gear up our services to handle such situations in the future.
Okay, that is at the supply side sort of findings, and that's absolutely true. Dr. Malhotra, I must bring you in. It was your father's death, painful as it was, that led you to re-examine your initial support, as it were, for the vaccine. Dr. Balbir points out that he was already somebody with 2 stents. Why were you then convinced?
Yeah, sorry, Barkha. Yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
false. So he did, I must clarify this, he had very mild furring, there was nothing. There was a rapid acceleration. His post-mortem showed something that was unexpected. He was very fit and well. So he shouldn't have had rapid severe disease. There was no stents. I think, lots of very important points have been raised by all of the respected colleagues here. And I think that, Barkha, just to come back to this, I think we need better data. You're absolutely right about this. When I did my paper, the initial narrative of my paper, which by the way is 10,000 words, right? And the reason I wrote 10,000 words was because one, I needed to break the data down. and then explain how we got it wrong, why we got it wrong, and solutions moving forward. And this is specific to the Pfizer mRNA vaccine that's been used in most of the European and West European countries, not used in India, which is very interesting. Indian government refused Pfizer to allow their vaccine to be used on the Indian population because they wanted indemnification against vaccine injuries, which is very interesting. So that is something probably for another discussion. And that was probably a very wise move by the Indian government. But when we look, so the question is, what are the clear knowns and what are the unknowns? Now, with the Pfizer vaccine, I can tell you that the reanalysis of the original trial, which is quite shocking, this is the most robust bit of data, randomized control trial, double-blind placebo, corrects for all sorts of confounders, done by very respected scientists, Robert Kaplan from Stanford, Peter Doshi, associated with the BMJ, published in the journal Vaccine a few months ago, showed the original trial revealed one was more likely to suffer a serious adverse event, hospitalization, disability, for example, than one was to be hospitalized with COVID. And that rate of serious adverse events was at 1 in 800, not 1 in 100,000 we're discussing. I know that's a different vaccine. In addition to that, Barkha, what I only discovered very recently, which shocked me, and I think this needs more explanation, is that the COVID Shield vaccine is essentially the AstraZeneca vaccine. Now, you said you've looked stuff up. I can tell you, and this is irrefutable, we stopped using that vaccine in this country because of the serious adverse events. There was no public announcement. And I wonder whether the reason there was no public announcement is because it was still being used in India. Now, there are so many conflicts of interest going back that people need to really re-examine what data is reliable, what isn't, and then we need to have a proper discussion.
But Dr. Malhotra, if I may interject.
One thing that's reassuring for the Indian population is you already said hybrid immune. A lot of people have got COVID already, and Omicron is much more mild. I think there is no justification for any further boosters. It's fascinating that 700 million Indians are refusing boosters, are not having it. That's extraordinary. That's very interesting. And coming back to the last colleague's survey, I suspect, Barkha, that many people know of somebody now, and they think and believe that they are getting an adverse effect from the vaccine.
But can I say something?
Yeah, and by the way, if you've had COVID,
I'd like to say something.
You are more likely to get side effects from the vaccine if you've had COVID already.
Well, I've had COVID twice that I know of, and I don't know how many more times. But my question to you, Dr. Malhotra, is this, right? Yeah. You have a view on the AstraZeneca. Most of India has been vaccinated by that vaccine, and the fact that more than 700 million Indians did not bother to get their booster points not just to immunity from infection, but also that they felt strong enough to not land up in hospital or have any severe disease, which to me would say that the AstraZeneca worked. But let me take it to the experts. You say otherwise. Let me get in. Oh, hang on. Let me get the others a chance. Dr. Agrawal. Yeah. Dr. Agrawal. Yeah, Anurag. Can we unmute Anurag?
Mute me. Yeah, great.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So we had the equivalent of a randomized control experiment within CSIR, where scientists got classified as health workers in some states and did not get classified as health workers in other states. So when the Delta wave came, we had some labs with vaccination, some labs without vaccination, over 10,000 people across the country, families. So we looked at a lot of this. The effectiveness of vaccinations in preventing severe disease during the Delta wave is beyond dispute. I mean, at least looking at Indian data, mostly for Covishield, little bit of Covaxin. Different efficacy, as you know, was being pointed out by Vineeta, is also very much there in the data. Severe disease efficacy was well over 90%. Infection protection was barely in the range of 60-70%, even during the Delta time. And we, with these many vaccinations, and Dr. Aseem talked about 1 in 100. And if AstraZeneca was any worse than that, and Britain had access to data of both AstraZeneca as well as Pfizer and Moderna, when they chose to continue Pfizer and Moderna and not continue with AstraZeneca into their vaccination program. So one can say that, using our India's experience, the adverse effect rate could not be sufficiently high to reach 1 in 100, or we would have seen it in our cohorts with tens of thousands of people. Similarly, in other countries, like for example, Qatar, in Singapore, even if you look at Hong Kong, if you look at who suffered in the Omicron wave, the BA.2 Omicron wave in Hong Kong earlier this year, it was the unvaccinated elderly, the elderly that took 2 doses of the killed vaccine. Almost nobody died amongst those people who took 2 doses of the mRNA vaccine and those people who took 3 doses of the killed vaccine. Yeah. So I think overall the data coming from around the world not necessarily from RCTs, but coming from very strong data from countries that did extensive vaccination, really favors the interpretation that I have, which is vaccines, yes, can have side effects, but the disease is significantly more dangerous than the vaccine. When the disease is very, very little, it may look vaccines may have more number of events compared to disease. But as the disease spreads, the pandemic wave that we worry about, that's where vaccines matter. And that's what we're all protecting from. And that's what I think where we are. I'll stop here.
Yeah, Sachin, before I give Vineeta the last word, because I just looked at it, we're almost out of time. You said there should be more research. What should we be? What should be the focus of this research?
So, Barkha, you shared data early on about deaths, for instance. Today, if you look at, how things happen in India, over the last 3 days, there have been 60 cremations at the Ghaziabad Hindan, Shamshan Ghat. 10 of those individuals are young, they were young individuals and they were heart attack deaths. Okay. We really need to start getting data from the ground, maybe directly from the Shamshan Ghats, where you actually, make it mandatory for, an individual or their family to basically submit the Aadhaar details. So those details can then be used and figured out, through the government databases, whether this individual was vaccinated or not vaccinated. If we can find anything about, their COVID infections, early on, that tracking was going on. So I think we really need to go to the ground to start collecting this data and then research and figure out, is it COVID that is causing it? Is it the vaccine that is causing it? So that I think is not there in India. And many of these deaths, somebody passes away in village, right here, I'm in Noida right now. And right here in one of the villages, you take them to the local Shamshan Ghat and you put the fire on. I mean, that's it. There is no registration. There is no, paperwork. And that is what is, of great concern. And by the way, we recently did a survey on booster dose, Barkha. 53% Indians today, as it stands, and this has got a pretty good sample again, are reluctant. They are not going to take the booster shot. So what is playing there, of course, is that the disease, is become, significantly less, mild. It's now much milder.
I have to say it's easy for
all
Indians
these
today.
sudden deaths.
It's easy today because we want to forget the trauma of the last 3 years to say, hey, we won't take the booster. If there were a surge today, the same people who were not taking it would be running to the hospital to get that vaccine, and then it would be too late because you cannot vaccinate your way out of a surge. So this is a sort of exceptionalism. India made this mistake between the two waves. We thought, oh, kuch nahi, nothing too much happened in the first wave. It won't in the second, and then we had Delta. But there is a scientific question to be asked about the boosters. There is a debate, very feisty debate within the scientific community right now. Does the booster make sense? Vineeta, I'll give you the last word on that. Coupled with the elephant in the room that none of us spoke about, has China's vaccine failed?
First, about China's vaccine, because we
Yes.
don't have enough data, and many other killed vaccines, which were more commonly used in China, have not been as efficacious in triggering immune response. So one can indirectly infer that the Chinese vaccine may not have been extremely potent in triggering protective immune response. This is compounded by the fact that the inactivated vaccines were made from the original Wuhan strain, and over the last 3 years, we have seen that there are changes in the virus and many variants, and Omicron is a problem because there are quite a few mutations there. So China the current version that is getting reported from China is an Omicron variant. And that in itself is quite different from Wuhan. So Wuhan-specific vaccination may not be the best option for protection, especially in the elderly, because I gather that elderly were not really vaccinated in enough numbers in China. But this is based on, bit of information here and there. there is a competition between India and China at times as to who is less transparent. So let's
No,
not
I,
go there.
I mean, I have to say, China was counting 5 deaths when people themselves were, talking about 9,000. So
Yes,
I think that would be an unfair comparison. But
sure,
of course, opacity is wrong wherever it is. I personally
agree,
chronicled how
completely.
deaths were uncounted in the second wave, even in India. But let me give you the last word on the booster. Would you be urging people today who haven't got the booster to get the booster, or would you say it's no point?
There is what I would say is for children below the age of 14, 15, traditional vaccine, which are protein based vaccine that are also gotten approval in India and have not been in use, those should be used because again they will provide some protection from serious illness. I understand that children do not get serious illness to begin with, but that is the only population which has not received even a single dose, and not everybody possibly might be infected. We don't have so much of data on the population below the age of 18 to say even those or all of those were 70-80% infected with during the Omicron wave or so far. So I think that is a population, and I would go, as I said, with the protein based vaccine which are in principle available and approved in India. So that's something that should be done. And I'm saying this because, again, Covaxin did not prove to be as efficient or as good as some others. So that is why the protein-based vaccine is what I'm thinking of. For the rest of us who have probably, a lot of us have hybrid immunity, I wouldn't think it is necessary. Most of us who have competent immune system will manage pretty well. If there are seriously immunocompromised individuals in one fashion or another, like 80 plus age group that Dr. Aseem was talking about, or the others, we need to think of them as a separate category and decide whether they should be given a booster, and if
But
so,
in general,
then protein booster or not.
In
No,
general,
I
you would
don't
not
think.
be urging a booster. Okay, we leave it there. Lots to think about, lots to agree on, lots to disagree on. Thanks, Aseem, for triggering the debate. Dr. Anurag, Dr. Malhotra, Dr. Bal, to Sachin, and to Dr. Balbir Singh. A pleasure. And we won't take our eye off the ball. We're going to watch carefully what happens in China, because what happens in one country impacts the world, certainly when it's China and the opacity of data. But data is very critical to all of our countries understanding what's actually going on with us post-pandemic or still in the shadows of the pandemic. And we'll continue to follow that story. Thank you for watching. Take care. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.